It's a Heidel minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
On today's Heidelcast, we're continuing to read from W. Robert Godfrey's essay, Calvin and Theonomy. This is from Theonomy, a Reformed Critique, edited by William S. Barker and W. Robert Godfrey, published by Zondervan in 1990. And we are at page 303. And I'm going to skip around a little bit after this to get some of the highlights, although I do recommend, if you're interested in this topic, that you read the whole essay for yourself. If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? You can make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link on the Heidel blog or by mailing a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027. Bob writes, for Calvin, the judicial laws of Moses themselves are a particular constitution of the Jews. They rest on and reflect the unchanging moral law of God, but insofar as they meet the specific historical circumstances of the Jews, they are not applicable to other nations. Not only may the specific judicial laws of the nations differ from the Jewish law, but Calvin says sharply, quoting here, the statement of some that the law of God given through Moses is dishonored when it is abrogated and new laws preferred to it is utterly vain. Close quote. And that is from the Institutes 4:16-20. So that's book 4, chapter 20, section 16. Bob continues, Calvin even addresses the question whether the penalties of the civil laws of Moses are binding on Christian nations. He concludes that different nations need different penalties for the same crimes because of different circumstances in those nations. He argues that if such diversity did not exist to meet the distinctive needs of different nations, the nations would not really be observing the moral law of God. Bob goes on to note that Calvin was a theocrat. He writes, Calvin insisted that the only true religion to be protected by the coercive action of civil government, quoting here, we must always bear in mind what I have already said, that this severity must not be resorted to except when the religion is suffering, which is not only received by public authority and general opinion, but which is proved on solid grounds to be true. So it may clearly appear that we are avengers of God against the wicked. Calvin here indicates that religious persecution is justified only when religion has been proved true and is legally established and popularly accepted, and when the attack on true religion is very serious. Only in these circumstances can the state punish such religious offenses as apostasy and blasphemy. Bob continues, beyond areas where the Mosaic law expresses the moral law, Calvin recognizes areas where the law given to Moses served specific purposes that were unique to Israel. For example, he sees the covenant given at Sinai as a renewal of the covenant made with Abraham, augmented to accomplish additional purposes. Quoting here, although the law is a testimony of God's gratuitous adoption and teaches that salvation is based upon his mercy and invites men to call upon God with sure confidence, yet it has this peculiar property that it covenants conditionally. Therefore, it is worthwhile to distinguish between the general doctrine, which was delivered by Moses, and the special command which he received. Close quote. Calvin learned this distinction from Paul, who in Galatians 3:19, quote, opposes the law to the promise given to Abraham, because as he is treating of the peculiar office, power, and end of the law, he separates it from the promises of grace. Close quote. Therefore, what is, quote, peculiar to the law, close quote, of Moses is, quoting again, to fill men's minds with fear, and by setting forth its terrible curse, to cut off the hope of salvation. For whilst it consists of 3 parts, each of them tends to the same end, that all should acknowledge themselves deserving of the judgment of eternal death, because in it God sustains no other character than that of judge. Close quote. Later on in his essay, Bob writes, Calvin and theonomists formally agree on many points. For example, they agree that civil government should be officially Christian. They agree that the government should enforce the first table as well as the second table of the Ten Commandments. They agree that capital punishment should be meted out for crimes such as apostasy and adultery. These agreements, however, are purely formal. These positions are reached by entirely different lines of thinking on the part of Calvin and the theonomists. Take, for example, the matter of execution for adultery. Theonomists believe that adulterers should be executed because Moses said so. It is as simple as that. Calvin reaches his conclusion very differently. Commenting on the woman taken in adultery, Calvin defends death as a punishment for adultery, reasoning that adultery is a heinous crime that dishonors marriage and promotes illegitimacy. He does not simply appeal to Moses, but reasons from the equity of the moral law. Most modern Calvinists do not agree with Calvin today in those areas of formal agreement with the theonomists mentioned above. They see Calvin's conclusions as somewhat parochial and naive, reflecting a perspective that still saw Europe both as the largest part of the world and as the Corpus Christianum. They believe that Calvin's own doctrine of depravity should make one less optimistic about the possibility or value of a Christian state. Nevertheless, most modern Calvinists share Calvin's interpretive approach to the Scriptures. They too stress the historical uniqueness of Israel and need to examine the specifics of the civil laws of Moses in light of the underlying moral law to find the contemporary applications of those laws. This approach is not always easy, but it is the mainstream of Reformed theology. Theonomy, by contrast, has a much simpler approach. Theonomists hold that the civil law of Moses, with some minor adjustments for modern problems, is to be followed today. Greg Bahnsen captures the spirit of this position in a chapter titled The Abiding Validity of the Law in Exhaustive Detail. In Rushdoony, there are many specific instances of contemporary direct appeal to the law of Moses that are completely at odds with Calvin's approach to law. For example, Rushdoony's discussion of divorce is entirely different from Calvin's, as presented above. Rushdoony's conclusion on divorce is that all the grounds for divorce in the law of Moses are still proper today. He writes, quote, "The law concerning marriage and divorce remains one throughout Scripture," close quote. In the unity of the Old and New Testaments, quote, the, quote, "Mosaic law is nowhere regarded as a lower or inferior legislation," close quote, on divorce. In discussing the, quote, "bill of divorce," close quote, allowed in the law of Moses, Rushdoony argues, quote, "Divorce is here certainly not seen as a barely tolerated evil, as some would have it," close quote. Yet Calvin precisely maintains that divorce is a barely tolerated evil in the law of Moses. Another example of the difference between Calvin and Rushdoony on the abiding requirement of the Mosaic law can be seen in their respective interpretations of Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 6, as a part of a general discussion of usury. Rushdoony writes, quoting here, "While interest is permitted on commercial loans, all such loans are under the restrictions of the Sabbath law. That is, their life is limited to 6 years. Every kind of debt by believers, whether as charity or for business reasons, must be short-term debt. Long-term debts are clearly a violation of the Sabbath," close quote. Calvin's interpretation of the passage is entirely different, quoting here. "Although we are not bound by this law at present, and it would not even be expedient that it should be in use, still the object to which it tended ought to be maintained. That is, that we should not be too rigid in exacting our debts, especially if we have to do it with the needy." Calvin went on to write, "The condition of the ancient people, as I have said, was different," close quote. The political agenda for theonomists, adopting the civil laws of Moses as modern civil law, is strongly supported by their optimistic eschatology. Their postmillennialism is a crucial aspect of the movement and makes their agenda not merely feasible but inevitable. Here, too, they are far from Calvin's sober amillennialism. The appeal of theonomy, like that of many contemporary Christian movements, is its simplicity and apparently biblical character. The great complexities and frustrations of the secular, modern world lead many to look for easy solutions. But in a fallen world, solutions to great political problems are not always easy. The approach of theonomy is a novel one in the Reformed community and uses Scripture in a way that is alien to Reformed Christianity. Rushdoony called Calvin's view of the civil law, quote, heretical nonsense, close quote. Calvin called a form of theocratic thinking remarkably like theonomy, quote, false and foolish, close quote. When it comes to law and civil government, Calvin and theonomy do not have much in common.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by HeidelbergReformationAssociation.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.